Welcome to the Modern Arizona podcast. Today's podcast is a little different. It's from one of our live events with the Modern Divorce Navigator, designed to make divorce less stressful and more manageable. If you enjoy the podcast, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're curious about the Navigator, check out the link in the description. We would love to have you join us. Now let's dive back into the episode. Welcome to the Modern Divorce Navigator series. I'm your host, Billy Tarasio from the Modern Divorce Podcast and Modern Law. And today I am joined by an alienation expert witness, Dr. Jean Mercer. Dr. Mercer, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is a topic that people are very, very interested in, and it's so controversial, and there's such strong feelings about this concept of alienation. How did you get into the field and become an expert witness?
Oh my. Well, let me start way back, because in the 1990s, I was doing some work that led me to be interested in how it's possible for psychological treatments to be harmful to children. Having, we say therapy, and that's supposed to mean something good. But we began to see that there were some things that people were doing that were not only not helpful, they were actually harmful. And as I got involved in that and time passed, I also became aware of parental alienation treatments and began to question whether those were harmful or helpful to children.
Okay, when you say parental alienation treatments, what do you mean?
I mean the kinds of treatments that are referred to as reunification therapy. So these are psychological treatments that are done in cases where children are avoiding contact with one of their parents, and it is thought that it's the other parent who have caused them to take this negative attitude. As I began to understand more about the parental alienation concept, I became more and more worried about it because it did not seem to me to hold up either scientifically or in terms of the therapies that were being used. And as I began to write about this, then people asked me to testify in court as well. Now, I'm not a clinical psychologist, so my testimony was primarily about the science behind claims of parental alienation.
Okay. All right. So this is so fascinating. What is the science behind the claims of parental alienation?
Well, it's an interesting question because I've just spent most of my morning working on a journal article called Unsettled Science, because I see that people who are advocates of the parental alienation concept are calling it settled science and saying we already know all about this, and presenting certain ideas which in fact are not very well supported scientifically. So what I'm trying to do is to lay out some of the work that's been done that is claimed to be adequate science, which supports the parental alienation idea, and to point out that, in fact, it doesn't meet the usual standards we have for psychological science. Now, I'd like to point out that I am not claiming that there is no such thing as parental alienation. I'm not claiming that there could not be such a thing as parental alienation. All I'm saying is that the claims that are being made in the courtroom, that there are scientific, that there is scientific work which has supported these ideas, that simply isn't true. What we have at this point is no established way to identify children who have been alienated. We have no way to tell those children, the ones who are avoiding contact with a parent, and it's said that the other parent has caused this. We have no way to tell that group of children from another group of children who are avoiding a parent, but they have other reasons for doing that.
Yeah.
So just the simplest measure of being able to identify what is and what is not a case of alienation. We don't have that at this point.
I can certainly understand that. I mean, being in the industry for 20 years and working on lots of family law cases, you see cases as a lawyer that look
Yep.
like alienation. And
Right.
to me, when it looks like alienation, it's the kids have rejected a parent that they used to have a good relationship with. They can't really tell you why, or the whys are so weird. Like, mom put me in the backyard with a popsicle and wouldn't let me come in 5 years ago. Like, just things that you wouldn't think would cause a child to reject a parent. What else? They reject their families. They reject, they previously had a good relationship with grandma and grandpa and aunts, and they've got like kind of a controlling, domineering, primary parent. So to me as a lawyer, when I see that collection of facts, it kind of looks like alienation. But I am not a doctor or a therapist. So tell me about, like, what do you think of those assumptions?
Okay, I think those are somewhat problematic assumptions. First of all, let's just look at this issue about whether the child used to have a good relationship with a parent. That's really quite difficult to establish whether they did have a good relationship. And you're going to see in some attempts at therapy that the therapist demands that the child come in with photographs or videos of lovely times they had with that parent in the past. Well, very few families videotape a parent having a screaming or,
Yeah,
rage fit and
right,
the child are slamming the door.
right.
We have this extremely biased representation of what their relationship was like. And in addition, I'd like to point out, not every parent is equally good with every age group. So
Right.
you
Or
can have
each
a
kid,
person,
right?
yeah, you can have a person who's really good with toddlers,
Mm-hmm.
but when the kid's a teenager, the parent is still acting as if
Mm-hmm.
they were a toddler.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so a good relationship then does, even if we could demonstrate it, doesn't necessarily mean a good relationship now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as to whether the children can really explain what's going
Yeah.
on or not, explain why they feel a particular way, um, obviously, there are things that are going to be hard for a preteen or even a teenager to explain. But in addition to that, it's my observation that in a lot of cases, the children are actually not allowed to say what they think. And in fact, there are people in what you might call the parental alienation community who would argue that it's bad for children to get listened to, that it gives them a bad idea about the hierarchy of the family, who's in charge, and they should not be allowed to speak at all about their complaints.
That sounds awful.
It does, it
Like,
does sound
how
awful.
are they supposed to repair a relationship if they're not able to speak freely?
How indeed. But if you look at various kinds of reunification therapy, you'll
Mm-hmm.
see that this is very often one of the rules. The child is not allowed to talk about anything that happened in the past. They're
Right.
only to talk about the present and the future of the relationship with that parent. And so they never get a chance to explain what it is that's actually on their minds. One other thing that's, I think, is sort of related to that, when you were giving a little, list of ways
Mm-hmm.
you're supposed to identify parental alienation.
And I don't know if that's what you're supposed to do.
Oh,
I've just,
no, it
this
it
is kind of
is.
what I've seen in the
No,
people I've dealt with.
I understand what you're saying, but
Mm-hmm.
that list that
Mm-hmm.
you were
Mm-hmm.
reciting, um, is a list that comes from parental alienation proponents and
Okay.
therapists who do that kind of work.
Okay.
And one of the items on the list is that there has been no substantiated complaint of abuse or serious neglect, or serious deficiencies in parenting. Well, a couple of things about this. First of all, it can be extremely difficult to substantiate abuse. And the fact that abuse is not substantiated should not be used to argue that it did not happen and that it has been proved that it did not
Right.
happen. Um, so that's a problem if the child is saying something happened, but it's a kind of thing that could not be substantiated. If somebody says so and so grabbed my private parts, well, there's no mark left. How is anybody to know that? That can't be substantiated.
Right.
But in addition to that, I just want to say that I think in a lot of these cases, that in fact, if we knew what that avoided parent really does, we would say it's not abuse, but boy, is it annoying. So, for example, if you have a parent who, consistently barges into the bathroom when their teenager is in the shower, the teenager says, please don't come in here without knocking like that. And the parent just keeps on doing it. This is a kind of behavior that would make another adult very angry.
Well, right. So
Are
to me,
we
that seems like a very reasonable thing to articulate as, I don't like this. I don't want to go over and see
right?
that person.
But you see that in many of these circumstances, the view is that the child should not be allowed to say that.
Oh.
That the parent is in charge. The child must respect the parent's authority, and what the parent says goes. And that, in fact, the argument is that it's really bad for the child's development if that's not how it is. That if you allow that child to be making decisions or telling the parent what to do, that this is going to destroy the child's respect for authority. And, what are they going to be like as an adult?
Independent.
Yeah, well, that was what I would hope, but that's not the way that some of these proponents would see it. But let me make one other comment about this, though. When we talk about whether the child's voice is heard or not, there are things that some of these kids have to say, which don't amount to a complaint of abuse, but you can see how the behavior would be disturbing to them. So, for example, I'm thinking of a case, two girls just entering their teens, and their parents had been divorced following the father having groomed the 15-year-old daughter of their neighbors. This was known to the whole town that he was doing this.
Oh, groomed. You said groomed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, groomed.
I heard groomed, and I'm like, what does this mean? But groomed. Okay, I got it.
It's a technical term. So when the girls started getting into their teens, they knew what had happened because in their small town, this was constantly talked about, and they became afraid that their father was going to approach them too. He didn't. Okay. But they were afraid of it, and they didn't want to go to his house because of this. This was not considered to be an acceptable reason. It was assumed that the mother must have in some way caused them to develop the bad feeling. And just one other case. Now, this is totally absurd, and I can't imagine the people standing up in court and talking about this. But the father thought that a really amusing thing to do would be to chase the kids around the house, farting at them. Obviously, this doesn't do them any real harm.
Right. Right. That's not typical adult behavior. I feel like my 11-year-old son might do that, though.
Right, exactly. And for all I know, when the kids were 5 and 6, they thought it was funny.
Sure.
It could have been. But now they say, Dad, don't, stop doing that. But he's going to keep on doing it because it's so funny. And, it's somebody else's fault if they don't like it. So, I'm certainly not saying that these two examples are repeated and common in my experience, but they do exist. And if a child could be encouraged to say what was really happening, and if the parent could be encouraged to think, maybe I better not do it if they dislike it so much, we might be able to get somewhere.
Yeah. So I have a bunch of questions from the audience, but I have one more question myself before I get to those questions. Do you think that like a really good family systems therapist would do a better job with these scenarios than the reunification specialists that are kind of alienation focused?
Yes, I do think that would be a much better idea to consider the child's life and the family's life in a much broader way, rather than just say our job is to reunite these people. However, I just want to say that I think in a number of cases, the parent that the children have been avoiding needs to do some work before going into the family therapy. That if we have somebody who is insisting that he or she decide exactly how things are going to be all the time, this is
Right,
not going to work very well with
right,
most kids.
right, right. I often say that, like when you're a divorced parent, you better change your behavior because your kids
Mhm.
have options at a certain point. And
Exactly.
if you think that you can parent teenagers with an iron fist, like at some point, they will simply choose the other parent.
They will choose, but if you then and your attorney representing you decide to play the parental alienation allegation card,
Uh-huh.
then you can tie this up for a long time,
Uh-huh.
and you can force the other parent to pay out a lot of money
Uh-huh.
for treatment until that other parent, has lost their house and everything and says, okay, I give up.
What I'm
So,
seeing now, and you tell me if you're seeing this too, is a shift towards understanding like that this is complicated. It's never ever, you know, as simple as my kids don't like me because I've been
right,
brainwashed.
right. I don't know, Billy, a shift on whose part in that direction? What do you think you see?
In the family court culture. So I would say like 5, 6, 8 years ago, camps, reunification camps were chatted about a lot more by judges who used them in threatening manners. And it seems like now that's less so. And now judges are more likely to understand that, um, how do you tell the difference between alienation and estrangement? You kind of,
Mhm.
it's really hard. It's really complicated. We're talking about humans.
All right. Well, I hope you're right.
Okay.
This is not really my experience,
Mm,
but it's also true that by the time people get to talking to me, their case has usually become quite exaggerated in
yeah.
nature.
Yeah. So you are working on behalf of mostly the parents who are defending themselves against alienation claims.
That's right.
Got it. Okay. Let me ask you some questions from our audience.
Okay.
I am at work, so I can't go on screen, but I have a question for Dr. Mercer. My 13-year-old is resisting/refusing to see me. Reunification therapy has been ordered, and dad continues to say she doesn't want to go. The judge since removed that order. Any ideas for me on how to reconnect?
Well, this is obviously a really difficult one, and I would say that the person asking the question really needs to try to review, what were the red flags? Did he or she see this coming? Um, and if so, what were the events that allowed it to be foreseen? If there were some events, if there was a big fight with a kid over some occasion, um, then I would say that if you could offer to the child, through the other parent, to go back and have a discussion of what happened then, uh, that might be a way to begin the connection. But the connection is going to have to include the child being able to speak up and to speak freely. And if that's difficult for them, perhaps to do it by email or text or just writing a note, drawing a picture, whatever they can do. And I think that quite often kids, if you ask them, will you explain to me what got you upset? You know, they it's hard for them not to be tempted to do it, you know. So, I would suggest that. I would also suggest that this parent might benefit from having a therapist or counselor to discuss this with and to see whether their own feelings about what happened are in some way standing in the way of reestablishing a connection.
Yeah. I want to build on that for a minute, because if a parent, and I'm not saying that this is true for this person, but if a parent is convinced the only reason my relationship with my child is strained is the other parent, then and the child is saying something else, then they're kind of at an impasse, right?
Mm-hmm,
You have to break the impasse.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So even if it is alienation, the alienated parent should not be talking about it or thinking about it, and should just be focused on, how do I build my relationship with this child right now, here today, regardless of how we got here.
Right. I would absolutely go along with that. I mean,
Yeah.
as soon as you bring in the so-called brainwashing part, then it goes back to the fight between the two parents. I
Mhm.
mean, to the extent that it's possible to omit that fight and just concentrate on how things are going with the child, what the child thinks, even if you think the child's completely mistaken,
Right.
what the child thinks is really important.
Right.
So I'd say, yeah, just, in some other life, you can fight it out, with your co-parent. But now what you want to do is to build the relationship with the child.
Next question. My friend's ex does not allow the child to talk to her father, who lives in another country. He has tried for a year to call, and he gets turned down. How is that not alienation?
There's a difference between alienation and interference with custody. And this guy sounds as I mean, I think they're both guys, right? I'm a little confused here. Um,
Mom isn't letting dad,
well,
who
the
lives in
mom
another
isn't.
country,
Okay. I
mom
mean,
isn't letting the kids talk to dad, who lives in another country.
okay, somehow I thought it was a step parent that was involved. Um, the question is, do the kids themselves not want to have contact? You can't claim that this is parental alienation unless the kids don't want contact.
So they might not even know.
Right.
Mm.
That's right. So if this person is interfering with contact, that also is not an acceptable thing to do.
Oh.
But it's a very different pattern than if the children have actually been convinced that they don't want to talk to him.
Right. Next question. If the child has been alienated for years, what are the biggest challenges in rebuilding the parent-child relationship, and what steps can the targeted parent take?
Well, can I say, first of all, that I don't really like the term targeted parent, because it sounds as though somebody just made up their mind, I'm really going to give that person a hard time. I tend to say the preferred parent and the non-preferred parent. It's certainly true that if you have a long gap in the relationship, that it gets to be quite difficult. But it sounds as though this person perhaps is in contact again and wants to go from there. Because if they're not in contact, I don't really know. The first question is how to get in contact. But if they are in contact, I would say that a very important thing is to keep in mind who the child is now, and that child is not the same person they were at the time of the divorce. So, just think about it. How would you make friends with somebody? What if a new family moves in next door to you, and one of their kids is 18 or 19, which this person's child might be? I don't know. How would you communicate with that young person in a way that would help, you create some kind of relationship with them? You have to think about what they're interested in, what their plans are, where they're going, and accept the fact that they don't care how unhappy you were about the whole thing. The way we arrange things between older and younger people in our society is that the older people are expected to listen to the problems of the younger ones, and the younger ones assume that they will never be old. So, they don't have to worry about those kinds of problems. And I would agree that that's not an ideal situation. But be that as it may, this kid is not going to expect to spend a lot of time listening to how lonely you were at Christmas and how you wish you could be there to give them their presents and so on. I would suggest act as if you really don't know each other, because in fact you don't, and go from there as you would in starting any friendship.
Love it. One more question from the audience. My question is that my 14-year-old has been told by his dad that I and the stepfather had an affair, and he is actually his biological father. He's told my son that the stepfather and I don't love him. That and telling him that I've lost my parental rights and I'll be in trouble if he reaches out to me, forcing him to block my number and social media. Is this alienation or not?
Whoa. So the child is living with...
Sounds like the child is living with dad, and
Okay.
and bio dad convinced the child that mom and stepdad, who the child doesn't see, that the stepdad is actually the biological dad, and that the mom doesn't love him, and the mom will be in trouble if the 14-year-old reaches out, so the child is forced to block the number.
Right. So mom wants to know what to do.
Alienation or not is the question, but really the question should be, what should I do? But
right. Well, I find the whole thing extremely confusing because on the one hand, there seems to be a statement that this child belongs to the stepfather. So the dad is saying, I'm not your biological father, but you have to stay with me and not talk to them. I would say that this is confusion rather than alienation.
I agree. And let's talk about, what do you do? Do you think that a non-preferred parent should use lawyers and courts to try to have contact with a child who doesn't want to see them?
I think in a case like the one that's just been described, in fact, we don't really know whether the child does or doesn't want to see them.
Right.
So this might be a good time to bring in the courts, which would give some power of somebody, the GAL or whoever, finding out from the child what their opinion really is. Because so far I haven't heard anything about the child's actual opinion. And if he's being made to block, that's one thing. If he's blocking because that's what he wants, that's another thing.
What I am hearing from you is, like, we have to get to the root of what's going on. Is the contact being cut off? Because if you've lost access and the contact's being cut off, then use the court to get your rights and to have them established, to see a child who wants to see you. If the child is saying they don't want to see you, get to the root of why and build the relationship. Any other big points?
Well, I just want to say that I think the point that you just made is an essential one, which is that the child must have a voice in this. I mean, if we're talking about a 2-year-old, obviously that's one thing. We're talking about a teenager. We would expect a teenager to be able to choose or to refuse a number of medical procedures. We would expect them to be able to testify if they were witness to a crime that had nothing to do with their family. We want them to develop autonomy and independence. To say that they can't speak is essentially saying to them, we don't care about you. If you want them to think that you care about them and therefore a relationship with them might eventually be possible, then you better act as if you do care what they think.
Dr. Mercer, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your perspectives and your expertise. I really appreciate it. I would love to have you back and dive in a little bit more to the science, because we didn't have enough time to go over that. So would you be willing to come back sometime?
I'd love to.
Wonderful.
Talking about the science is my thing.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we'll talk again soon.
Okay. Thanks, Billy.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to the Modern Arizona podcast. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, make sure to download it, like it, leave a review, and share it with your friends. If you know someone who would be a good guest or you would like to be on the Modern Arizona podcast, make sure to give us an email or reach out to us at mymodernlaw.com.